Welcome to Exhausting Stories, where tonight you'll drift through the pages of history. Close your eyes and join us as we follow the extraordinary life of Theodore Roosevelt, the Rough Rider, the reformer, the man who read a book a day and faced death more than once with a steady hand. Tonight, you'll float through his memories, from the dusty battlefields of Cuba to the quiet halls of the White House, from roaring rivers deep in the Amazon to the silent forests he fought to protect. If you enjoy stories that carry you gently through time, remember to subscribe and let history whisper you to sleep. From the start, Theodore Roosevelt's life was defined by struggle. He was a small, pale child, often confined to bed by severe asthma attacks that left him gasping for air. His family tried everything the era offered, but medical options were limited. Nights were especially hard. His parents would watch helplessly as he fought for each breath. While his mind was sharp and curious, his frail health set him apart from the robust, energetic world of his father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr. Roosevelt Sr. was a powerful presence, large in stature, generous in spirit, and endlessly optimistic. Young Theodore admired him deeply. But admiration alone wasn't enough. His father's approach was direct and demanding. "You have the mind, but you have not the body." Rather than sheltering his son, Roosevelt Sr. insisted that Theodore face his weakness head-on. He built a small gym in their home and prescribed a regimen of exercise and fresh air, believing that discipline and exposure to the outdoors could build strength where medicine failed. The home gym became the setting for young Theodore's first real battle, as he began lifting weights and practicing calisthenics, sweating, straining, and pushing his limits. The work was exhausting, but it marked the beginning of his transformation. Those early training sessions were grueling for a boy so often ill. Yet Roosevelt approached them with a stubborn resolve. He forced himself through each repetition, determined to make his body as his father had urged. The pain and fatigue were constant reminders of his limitations, but he refused to back down. The gym was only the first step. Roosevelt also spent more time outdoors, walking and riding whenever his lungs would allow. His father's insistence on fresh air therapy meant that even on bad days, Theodore was bundled up and sent outside, where he began to develop a love for nature that would later shape his views on conservation. But physical training alone wasn't enough. Roosevelt's fight against weakness took on a new dimension when he discovered boxing. What began as therapy for his asthma soon became an obsession. In the ring, he learned to take hits, real, punishing blows that left bruises and black eyes. He wasn't a natural fighter, but he was relentless. Each time he was knocked down, he got back up, determined to outlast his opponent. In one of his early matches, he realized he could withstand more punishment than he thought possible. This moment of endurance wasn't just about sport, it was a revelation. The resilience he built in the gym and the boxing ring would later echo on battlefields and in political fights, where taking a hit and pushing forward became second nature. Roosevelt's physical transformation ran parallel to a deepening intellectual curiosity. He filled notebooks with observations about the natural world, collecting and cataloging specimens for what he called the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. His fascination with animals, birds, and insects wasn't just a hobby. It was a way to connect with life beyond the walls of his sick room. This passion for nature, born in childhood, would one day fuel his drive to protect America's wild places as president. The lessons of these years shaped his personal philosophy, which he would later call the strenuous life. He wrote, "I wish to preach not the doctrine of ignoble ease, but the doctrine of the strenuous life, the life of toil and effort." For Roosevelt, strength, physical and moral, was not inherited but earned through constant struggle. The discipline of daily exercise, the grit of the boxing ring, and the curiosity of a budding naturalist all reinforced his belief that adversity was not something to be avoided, but embraced as a path to growth. By his teenage years, Roosevelt had developed a kind of restless energy. He was still prone to illness, but he no longer let it define him. He spent hours outdoors, studying wildlife, hiking, and expanding his personal museum. He also continued to box, sparring with friends and trainers, determined to toughen both body and mind. His achievements were not limited to physical feats. His academic work remained impressive, and he began to show early signs of leadership among his peers. Roosevelt's father remained a guiding influence, not just by urging him to build his body, but by modeling a life of service and moral conviction. Theodore Sr. was known for his charity work and his willingness to help those less fortunate. He taught his son that strength should be used for the benefit of others, not just personal gain. This lesson took root in young Theodore, shaping his sense of duty and his later commitment to public service. The connection between hardship and character became clear to Roosevelt as he grew older. Each asthma attack, each exhausting workout, and each bruising boxing match forged a deeper sense of resilience. He learned that setbacks were temporary and that perseverance could turn weakness into strength. This foundation of grit would serve him well in the years ahead as he faced challenges far greater than childhood illness. Roosevelt's early transformation was not just a story of overcoming physical weakness. It was about redefining what strength meant, combining intellect, moral purpose, and physical endurance into a new model of manhood. His childhood struggles did not disappear, but they became part of the story he told himself, that effort, not ease, was the path to greatness. The boy who once struggled to breathe became a young man eager for greater tests. His passion for nature and adventure, his love of competition, and his growing sense of responsibility all pointed him toward a larger stage. He was no longer content to remain within the familiar world of New York City's elite. The drive that had pushed him to conquer his own body now pushed him to seek challenges beyond the safety of home. Roosevelt's journey of self-transformation set the stage for everything that followed. The lessons learned in the gym and the boxing ring, the long hours spent cataloging birds and insects, and the moral example set by his father all combined to prepare him for the storms ahead. He had built a foundation of resilience, curiosity, and determination, qualities that would soon be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. As Roosevelt approached adulthood, he carried with him the scars and strengths of his early battles. He was ready for new challenges, but nothing could have prepared him for the personal tragedy that would soon upend his life. The next chapter would force him to leave behind the comfort of family and privilege and confront loss on a scale he had never known. It was in the wake of heartbreak that Roosevelt would make a choice that changed everything, one that would take him far from the world he knew and lead him into the harsh, unfamiliar landscape of the American West. Theodore Roosevelt's world changed in a single shattering day. On February 14, 1884, he lost both his mother and his wife to illness just hours apart. The grief was immediate and overwhelming. Hours after the burials in New York, Roosevelt made a decision that surprised everyone. He sold his house and set out for the Dakota Territory. The West offered distance from sorrow and a chance to rebuild himself far from the reminders of his old life. Arriving in Medora, North Dakota, Roosevelt stood out among the locals. He looked every bit of the outsider. His Eastern manners, Harvard education, and carefully chosen gear clashed with the practical, worn look of the cowboys. When he first appeared in town, the seasoned ranch hands and townsfolk didn't hide their skepticism. They laughed at his attempts to fit in, calling him a dude and doubting he'd last a week. Rather than turn back, Roosevelt responded by buying 2 ranches in the Badlands and throwing himself into the hard life of a cattleman. Roosevelt's new world was unforgiving. The Badlands were harsh, scorching in summer, bone-chilling in winter. Every day demanded physical labor and exposed him to dangers he'd never faced before. He learned to ride for hours across rough country, to rope stubborn cattle, and to hunt for food and protection. The work was relentless, but Roosevelt didn't shrink from it. He fell off horses, botched roping attempts, and endured the jokes of men who'd grown up on the frontier. Each time he failed, he got back up. Over time, his persistence paid off. The same men who mocked him began to respect his willingness to learn and his refusal to quit. The transformation was both physical and emotional. The vast, lonely landscape gave Roosevelt space to process his grief, but it also demanded his full attention. Days were spent working cattle, fixing fences, and weathering storms. Nights brought a different kind of challenge. Solitude under a sky crowded with stars, the silence broken only by the wind and the sounds of distant animals. The West stripped away the distractions of his old life and forced him to confront loss and uncertainty head-on. Roosevelt found that the lessons of the West went beyond skill with horses or a rifle. He learned humility from the cowboys and ranchers who measured a man by his actions, not his background. He listened to their stories, shared in their hardships, and came to understand the rhythms of a life far removed from the drawing rooms of New York. "I owe more than I can express to the West," he later wrote, capturing how deeply the experience changed him. His time in the Dakotas wasn't all routine. At one point, Roosevelt was asked to serve as a deputy sheriff, a rare honor for an outsider. When thieves stole a boat on the Little Missouri River, Roosevelt tracked them for 40 hours without sleep, pushing through freezing temperatures and rough terrain. To stay awake, he read Tolstoy by firelight during brief pauses. When he finally caught up with the thieves, he captured them and personally escorted them to trial. Stories like this spread through the region and helped cement his reputation as someone who could be counted on in a crisis. Life on the ranch was unpredictable and often unforgiving. Roosevelt faced the full force of nature during the winter of 1886-1887, when a series of brutal blizzards swept across the Great Plains. Temperatures plunged, snow drifted high, and thousands of cattle perished. Roosevelt lost hundreds of animals, almost his entire herd. The financial loss was devastating, but what mattered more was the lesson he took from it. The blizzard showed him that even the hardest work could be undone by forces beyond his control. Instead of breaking him, the experience taught Roosevelt to persevere through defeat and disappointment. This resilience would become a defining feature of his character, preparing him for challenges yet to come. The West didn't just reshape Roosevelt's sense of self, it also broadened his understanding of the country he hoped to serve. He saw firsthand the struggles of farmers and ranchers, the impact of drought and industrial expansion, and the delicate balance between people and the land. These experiences laid the groundwork for his later commitment to conservation. Witnessing the cycles of drought and overgrazing, Roosevelt began to see the need to protect natural resources for future generations, a belief that would define much of his later legacy. Roosevelt's years in the Badlands gave him a new image, but more importantly, they gave him a new perspective. He was no longer just an Eastern intellectual or a wealthy politician. He had earned the respect of the people around him by working alongside them, sharing their hardships, and standing up when it counted. This ability to connect with ordinary Americans became one of his greatest strengths. When he eventually returned to public life, he brought with him the lessons and scars of the West. He later reflected that the West took the snob out of me. The blend of privilege and perseverance he carried made him unique among his peers. He could speak with authority about the realities of life on the frontier, and people listened. The transformation wasn't about abandoning his past, but about bringing together the best of both worlds: his education, his ambition, and the grit he'd earned through hard work and loss. By the time Roosevelt left the Dakotas, he was no longer running from grief. The hardships he faced had given him a deeper sense of purpose and a clearer vision of the kind of leader he wanted to be. He understood that true strength meant facing adversity, learning from failure, and never letting setbacks define you. These lessons would guide him through the next stage of his life, where new challenges and new opportunities to lead were waiting. The next chapter would test the limits of everything he had learned. As Roosevelt moved from the plains back to public service, he would soon find himself in a position of growing influence, drawn into events that would demand not just resilience, but bold action on a national stage. In Washington, Theodore Roosevelt's energy and impatience set him apart. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897, he found himself in a position of real influence, but the day-to-day reality often felt stifling. The United States was on the brink of war with Spain over Cuba's fight for independence, and Roosevelt saw the moment as a test not just for the nation, but for himself. He believed America was destined for leadership, and that it had a duty to act, morally and militarily. To Roosevelt, Spain's rule over Cuba represented a backward, decaying force that had no place in the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt made his presence felt in the Navy Department. He pushed for readiness, ordered supplies, and repositioned ships, sometimes stretching his authority. His conviction that war was necessary was stronger than the caution of his superiors, and he grew restless with the slow pace of government. For Roosevelt, planning and paperwork were never enough. As the conflict became certain, he wanted to do more than organize from afar. He wanted to fight alongside the men he was sending into harm's way. The declaration of war in 1898 gave Roosevelt his chance. To the shock of many in Washington, he resigned his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, giving up comfort and political security for the uncertainty of battle. He immediately set out to form a volunteer cavalry regiment for service in Cuba. This was the origin of the first U.S. volunteer cavalry, the Rough Riders. Roosevelt's vision for the unit was as unconventional as he was. He recruited men from all walks of life: cowboys from the West, miners, Native Americans, Ivy League athletes, and New York policemen. The result was a regiment that looked like a cross-section of America, united by the promise of adventure and the leadership of a man who believed in action above all. Training began in San Antonio, Texas. The Rough Riders faced sweltering heat, basic camps, and the challenge of learning to work together despite their differences. Roosevelt was everywhere, helping with drills, pushing through supplies, and sharing in the discomforts of camp life. He insisted on training as hard as anyone, building trust not through words but through shared hardship. His leadership style was direct and personal, and it quickly won over the men. He was not content to command from a distance. He wanted to experience every aspect of their struggle. When the Rough Riders finally shipped out to Cuba, chaos followed. The landing was disorganized, and the realities of tropical warfare, mud, heat, disease, tested them before they even saw combat. But Roosevelt was determined to keep morale high. He moved among his men, encouraging them, sharing their burdens, and making sure their needs were met as best as possible. His presence made a difference, especially as the regiment prepared for what would become the defining moment of their campaign. The Battle of San Juan Heights, and specifically the charge up Kettle Hill, became the centerpiece of Roosevelt's military story. After days of marching through dense jungle and facing sniper fire, the Rough Riders, along with other American units, found themselves pinned down at the base of the hill. Orders were unclear, and many officers hesitated, waiting for reinforcements. Roosevelt saw the danger in delay. Without waiting for new commands, he made the decision to lead a direct assault. Mounted on horseback, he became the only man visible above the crowd, instantly drawing enemy fire. Roosevelt later called it the great day of my life. Bullets tore through the air, striking the ground and cutting down men around him. He kept moving, urging his troops forward, shouting encouragement and refusing to take cover. His willingness to lead from the front, despite the danger, inspired those around him. The Rough Riders surged up the hill, braving open ground and entrenched Spanish defenders armed with modern rifles. The attack was risky, bordering on reckless, but it succeeded. The Americans took Kettle Hill and then helped capture the larger San Juan Heights, breaking the Spanish line and opening the way to Santiago. The victory came at a high cost. Many Rough Riders were killed or wounded, and disease soon swept through the camp, claiming even more lives. Roosevelt was deeply affected by the losses, and he spent much of his time after the fighting advocating for better care and recognition for his men. He wrote letters to officials in Washington, demanding proper treatment and support for those who had served. For him, leadership did not end when the shooting stopped. Roosevelt's actions in Cuba made headlines across the United States. Newspapers carried stories of his courage and the exploits of the Rough Riders. His own detailed account of the battle, published soon after, only added to his reputation. He described not just his own actions, but the bravery and sacrifice of the men around him, painting a picture of unity and determination that resonated with readers. The public saw him as the embodiment of American values, brave, energetic, and unafraid to get his hands dirty. The war also changed Roosevelt on a personal level. He had always believed in the virtues of courage and hard work, but the experience of combat deepened those convictions. He saw firsthand the cost of leadership and the responsibilities it carried. The lessons of the battlefield reinforced his belief that strength and action were necessary, but they also taught him the importance of caring for those under his command. The war was not just a chapter in his career, it became a touchstone for his ideas about duty, honor, and service. Roosevelt's return to the United States was met with celebrations and parades. He was a national hero, and his popularity soared. The momentum from his wartime service propelled him into the political spotlight. In the months following the war, he was nominated for governor of New York. His campaign leaned heavily on his war record and the image of the Rough Rider who had led from the front. Voters responded, and he won the election, beginning a new phase of public service with the same energy he had brought to the battlefield. The image of Roosevelt charging up Kettle Hill became more than a story. It was a symbol. Americans saw in him a leader who did not hesitate, who took risks, and who stood with ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The Rough Riders became legendary, but it was Roosevelt's character, his willingness to act, to endure hardship, and to inspire others that truly set him apart. As governor, Roosevelt brought the lessons of war to the task of reform. He pushed for changes in government, fought corruption, and tried to make the state more responsive to the needs of its citizens. The same qualities that had defined his military leadership, decisiveness, directness, and a sense of responsibility, now shaped his approach to politics. He was not content to maintain the status quo. He wanted to make a difference. Roosevelt's rise from soldier to statesman happened quickly, but it was no accident. The qualities that had earned him respect on the battlefield, courage, persistence, and a willingness to challenge expectations, were the same ones that now drove his political career. His experiences in Cuba remained a constant reference point, shaping his sense of what was possible and reminding him of the costs and rewards of leadership. By the end of the decade, Roosevelt's reputation as a reformer and a man of action made him a natural choice for higher office. His time as a Rough Rider had transformed him from a promising politician into a national figure, ready for challenges on a larger stage. The next step would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would place Roosevelt at the center of American life in a way few could have imagined. Suddenly, the nation was watching as Roosevelt stepped into a new role, one that would test every lesson he had learned and every value he held. When Theodore Roosevelt took the oath of office in September 1901, the country faced an uncertain future. At just 42 years old, he became the youngest president in American history, stepping into the nation's highest office after the assassination of President William McKinley. This was not the path Roosevelt had envisioned. He had accepted the vice presidency reluctantly, believing it would sideline him from real influence. At the time, the vice presidency was often seen as a ceremonial dead end, a place where political careers quietly faded. But history had other plans, and Roosevelt's life of action was about to enter its most visible chapter. The shock of McKinley's assassination rippled through Washington and across the nation. Roosevelt's arrival in the White House unsettled many in the political establishment. He was already known as an energetic reformer, someone who challenged the status quo and refused to be constrained by tradition. Critics in Congress and the press called him reckless and impulsive, doubting whether someone so young and outspoken could handle the seriousness of the presidency. The public, too, was unsure how this new leader would shape the country's direction. Roosevelt wasted no time making his intentions clear. He did not see himself as a caretaker or a placeholder. Instead, he moved quickly to assert his own vision for the presidency. Roosevelt adopted what he called the stewardship theory, a belief that the president had a duty to act in the nation's interest unless the Constitution or law explicitly forbade it. This was a significant break from the more passive leadership styles that had dominated the post-Civil War era. Where previous presidents had often deferred to Congress, Roosevelt saw the executive as the driving force of government, responsible for seizing opportunities and solving problems as they arose. One of the ways Roosevelt transformed the office was through his use of the bully pulpit. For him, the presidency was not just a position of authority, but an unparalleled platform to speak directly to the American people. Bully, in his vocabulary, meant excellent or superb. Roosevelt recognized that he could shape public debate, rally support, and explain his policies in plain language that resonated with ordinary citizens. He spoke with energy and clarity, making complex issues understandable and relevant, and he used interviews, speeches, and public appearances to build a personal connection with the nation. Roosevelt's style was different from any president who had come before. He was visible, active, and approachable. He met with workers, business owners, and reformers. He rode horses through Washington's parks, led hunting trips, and welcomed guests from all walks of life to the White House. This hands-on approach wasn't just for show. It set a new tone for presidential leadership. Roosevelt's presence in the public eye made the office feel more accessible. One of the most telling examples of Roosevelt's leadership came in 1902, when a major coal strike threatened to leave millions of Americans without heat as winter approached. Instead of waiting for Congress to act or hoping the dispute would resolve itself, Roosevelt brought both the mine owners and the striking workers to the White House. He personally mediated the talks, refusing to let either side walk away until they found a solution. This was the first time a president had intervened so directly in a labor dispute. The eventual compromise didn't satisfy everyone, but it kept homes warm and signaled a new willingness to use presidential power to address pressing national problems. This approach reflected Roosevelt's broader domestic agenda, which he called the Square Deal. The Square Deal was not a single law or program, but a guiding principle. Every American deserved a fair chance, whether they were a worker, a consumer, or a business owner. Roosevelt believed that government should step in to balance competing interests and ensure that no one group, especially the wealthy and powerful, could dominate at the expense of others. The Square Deal guided his efforts to improve workplace safety, regulate food and drugs, and protect consumers from corporate abuse. Roosevelt's activism extended to the nation's natural resources. He was a passionate outdoorsman, and he saw firsthand how unchecked development and exploitation threatened America's forests, rivers, and wildlife. During his presidency, he set aside millions of acres for national parks, forests, and wildlife refuges. He established the United States Forest Service and signed into law the Antiquities Act, which allowed him to protect historic and scientific sites as national monuments. Roosevelt's conservation efforts laid the foundation for the modern environmental movement and changed the way Americans thought about the land they shared. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Some business leaders and politicians accused Roosevelt of overstepping his authority. They argued that his activism threatened the balance of power and undermined the checks and balances built into the Constitution. Roosevelt, however, saw his role differently. He believed that the president should lead boldly when the public good was at stake. To him, government was not just a referee, but an active force for justice, fairness, and progress. Roosevelt's actions earned him the nickname Trustbuster. He did not oppose all big business. He often said that large corporations were a natural result of modern industry, but he insisted that they must operate fairly and under the rule of law. His approach was pragmatic. Regulate where necessary, break up abuses of power, and encourage honest competition. This balance helped restore public faith in government and reassured ordinary Americans that someone in power was looking out for their interests. Throughout his presidency, Roosevelt's energy and vision made the office the center of American political life. He set a standard for what the nation could expect from its leader, not just a caretaker, but a force for change. His use of the bully pulpit, his willingness to intervene in crises, and his commitment to fairness helped redefine what it meant to be president. Roosevelt's legacy was not just in the laws he signed or the battles he fought, but in the way he expanded the possibilities of the office itself. As Roosevelt's first years in office unfolded, the country began to see what was possible when a president embraced action and responsibility. The changes he set in motion affected everything from labor relations to environmental policy, and his leadership style became a model for those who followed. But some of his most challenging and high-profile fights were still ahead. The next stage of his presidency would bring him face-to-face with the era's most powerful industrialists, and the question of how to balance prosperity with fairness would move to the center of national debate. America at the start of the 20th century was a place of booming industry and deepening inequality. Large corporations, known as trusts, had grown powerful enough to control entire sectors of the economy: railroads, oil, steel, and more. These trusts weren't just economic forces, they were political ones, shaping elections, influencing Congress, and setting prices that affected the daily lives of millions. For most Americans, the result was a sense of powerlessness. Workers endured dangerous conditions for meager pay. Small business owners struggled to survive, often pushed aside by companies with the resources to undercut them or buy them out. The frustration was everywhere, and calls for reform grew louder with each passing year. Theodore Roosevelt saw the rise of these monopolies as a direct challenge to the nation's core values. He believed that unchecked corporate power threatened both democracy and the stability of the economy. To Roosevelt, the government had a responsibility to act, not to punish success, but to ensure that prosperity was shared and that the rules were fair for everyone. The idea of simply standing by while a handful of industrialists amassed unprecedented influence was unthinkable to him. He made it clear that his presidency would not be defined by inaction. Roosevelt's first major test came with the Northern Securities Company. This holding company, backed by railroad giants and financiers like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller, aimed to dominate rail transport across the northern United States. By controlling key rail lines from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest, Northern Securities could set freight prices, eliminate competition, and dictate terms to farmers, merchants, and passengers alike. To the public, the company became a symbol of everything wrong with the trusts: secret deals, price fixing, and the crushing of competition. Armed with the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law passed in 1890 but rarely enforced against corporations, Roosevelt directed the Justice Department to sue Northern Securities. The move shocked the business world and many in Roosevelt's own party. Some Republicans, dependent on donations from the very trusts Roosevelt was targeting, pressured him to back down. J.P. Morgan himself offered a private compromise, hoping to settle the issue behind closed doors. Roosevelt refused, insisting that the law must be applied equally, no matter how wealthy or powerful the defendant. In 1904, the Supreme Court sided with Roosevelt, ordering the breakup of Northern Securities. For the first time, the federal government had used its power to challenge a major monopoly, and won. This victory earned Roosevelt the nickname Trust Buster. But his approach was more nuanced than that label suggests. Roosevelt didn't believe that every large company was automatically harmful. He often spoke about good trusts and bad trusts. Good trusts, in his view, operated efficiently and treated workers and consumers fairly. Bad trusts used their size to crush competition and manipulate markets for their own benefit. Roosevelt's goal was not to destroy big business, but to ensure that it served the public interest. To make this possible, Roosevelt supported the creation of the Department of Commerce and Labor, which included the Bureau of Corporations. This new agency gave the government tools to investigate business practices, collect data, and intervene when companies crossed the line. It was a way to bring transparency to industries that had long operated in the shadows. Roosevelt believed that sunlight was the best disinfectant. If the public could see how these corporations operated, they would demand accountability. Journalists played a crucial role in building support for Roosevelt's efforts. Ida Tarbell's investigative series on Standard Oil, published in McClure's magazine, exposed the ruthless tactics John D. Rockefeller used to build his oil empire. Tarbell's detailed reporting showed how Standard Oil secured secret rebates from railroads, spied on competitors, and drove small businesses out of the market. Her work made the complex world of monopolies understandable to ordinary readers, fueling public anger and strengthening the case for reform. Roosevelt's administration filed 45 antitrust lawsuits during his presidency, targeting giants like Standard Oil and the American Tobacco Company. These cases often dragged on for years, but the message was clear. The era of unchecked monopoly was ending. Even when the government didn't immediately break up a company, the threat of legal action forced corporations to think twice about abusing their power. The business landscape began to shift. Companies could no longer assume they were above the law. Beyond the courtroom, Roosevelt pushed for laws that would prevent abuses before they started. The Hepburn Act of 1906 gave the Interstate Commerce Commission real authority to regulate railroad rates. Before this, railroads could offer secret deals to large shippers and charge small farmers whatever they pleased. The new law helped level the playing field, making sure that transportation, the backbone of commerce, was fair for everyone. Roosevelt's focus on regulation extended into other industries as well. Public concern over unsafe food and medicine reached a peak after the publication of Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, which exposed filthy conditions in meatpacking plants. Roosevelt responded by championing the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act, both passed in 1906. These laws required honest labeling and regular inspections, protecting consumers from dangerous products and deceptive advertising. Roosevelt understood that trust in the marketplace depended on more than just breaking up monopolies. It required rules that put the public's safety first. Opposition to Roosevelt's activism was fierce. Conservative Republicans accused him of overreaching and threatening the foundations of American capitalism. Some tried to block his nomination for a second term, hoping to return to a more business-friendly administration. But Roosevelt's popularity with ordinary Americans only grew. His landslide victory in the 1904 election gave him the political strength to continue his reforms. He saw this win as a sign that the country wanted a government willing to stand up to powerful interests. Roosevelt's trust-busting campaign was not without its complications. When Standard Oil was eventually broken up, John D. Rockefeller's personal fortune actually increased since he held shares in the new companies that replaced the old monopoly. Some critics argued that the breakup did not create real competition, as the new companies often cooperated behind the scenes. Even Ida Tarbell, whose reporting had helped bring about the lawsuit, later noted that the hoped-for competition had not fully materialized. Yet the broader impact of Roosevelt's actions was undeniable. Corporations now understood that government oversight was real and that abuses of power would be challenged. For Roosevelt, the long-term solution was not just legal battles, but a system of ongoing regulation. He wanted the government to act as a referee, ensuring that the rules were clear and that no one could gain an unfair advantage. The Hepburn Act, the Bureau of Corporations, and consumer protection laws all worked together to create a new relationship between business and government. Roosevelt's vision was a marketplace where innovation and growth could thrive, but where the public interest always came first. The trust-busting era changed the way Americans thought about the role of government. Before Roosevelt, most people assumed that the federal government should stay out of economic affairs. After his presidency, it became clear that strong leadership and active oversight were sometimes necessary to protect the public from the excesses of private power. Roosevelt's willingness to confront the biggest names in business set a new standard for what presidents could and should do. His fight against monopolies shaped the American economy for decades to come. It also helped define his legacy as a leader who believed in fairness, opportunity, and the importance of standing up for ordinary people. Roosevelt's reforms proved that government could be a force for good, not just a bystander. But Roosevelt's ambitions reached beyond the world of business and industry. As he looked at the nation's future, he saw another challenge that demanded urgent attention, not in the boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the wild places that still dotted the American landscape. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency marked a turning point in how Americans thought about the land around them. With industry spreading fast, forests were shrinking, rivers ran polluted, and open spaces vanished as companies rushed to extract every possible resource. Factories dumped waste into streams, lumber companies leveled entire forests, and mining operations left scars across the landscape. Many believed these resources were endless, but Roosevelt saw the dangers of such thinking. He recognized that the nation's prosperity and its future depended on protecting what remained. Roosevelt's drive to save America's wilderness came from a deep personal bond with nature. As a child, his health was fragile, but time outdoors offered relief and inspiration. Later, his years in the Dakota Badlands shaped his views even more. The wild lands he explored weren't just beautiful, they restored him, grounded him, and showed him what could be lost if people were careless. These experiences convinced Roosevelt that preserving wilderness was not just about scenery. It was about the survival and spirit of the country. Convincing others, though, was a challenge. Powerful companies made fortunes from logging, mining, and development. Many politicians tied to these industries dismissed conservation as a threat to jobs and progress. Timber barons and mining executives lobbied hard, insisting that restrictions would hurt workers and stall economic growth. Roosevelt faced criticism from every side, but he believed that failing to protect the land would cost the country far more in the long run. Instead of backing down, Roosevelt used the presidency's platform to speak directly to the public. He argued that conservation was a responsibility, not a luxury. We recognize the right and duty of this generation to develop and use the natural resources of our land, but we do not recognize the right to waste them or to rob them by wasteful use, the generations that come after us, he declared. He spoke to farmers seeing their topsoil blow away, to families losing clean water, and to anyone who cared about the country's future. Conservation, he said, was about protecting livelihoods as much as landscapes. Roosevelt moved quickly from words to action. Early in his administration, he pushed for the creation of the U.S. Forest Service in 1905. He chose Gifford Pinchot, a professional forester and close ally, to lead it. Together they introduced a new way of thinking. Forests and other resources could be used, but only with care and planning. Logging would continue, but not at the expense of the land's ability to recover. The Forest Service set out to balance use with renewal, ensuring that future Americans would have the same opportunities as those living now. But the threats to wild places kept growing. Roosevelt needed more powerful tools to protect them. The Antiquities Act of 1906 gave him the authority to declare certain lands as national monuments, protecting them with the stroke of a pen. He used this power boldly, setting aside places like the Grand Canyon and Devil's Tower, sites that might otherwise have been lost to mining or development. The Grand Canyon, for example, had faced repeated threats from mining companies eager to dig into its walls. Roosevelt's action kept it safe for future generations. His approach to conservation was pragmatic. He didn't want to lock up every acre, but he insisted on managing resources so they would last. He established 5 new national parks, expanded the national forest system by more than 150 million acres, and designated 18 national monuments. He also created 51 bird reserves, beginning with Pelican Island in Florida. There, plume hunters were decimating bird populations for the fashion trade. By setting aside the island as a federal bird preserve, the first of its kind, Roosevelt showed he was willing to act quickly and decisively when wildlife was at risk. These actions added up. By the time he left office, Roosevelt had protected over 230 million acres of public land. This staggering number meant that, on average, he set aside more than 80,000 acres for every day he was president. The land he preserved included forests, mountains, wetlands, and habitats for countless species. His efforts laid the foundation for the National Wildlife Refuge System and expanded the reach of national parks and forests, giving Americans places to explore, hunt, fish, and simply enjoy the outdoors. Roosevelt's vision for conservation was never just about scenery or recreation. He saw it as a way to secure the nation's future. Healthy forests protected watersheds and prevented floods. Carefully managed land supported farmers and ranchers. Wildlife refuges kept species from vanishing forever. He believed that progress and preservation could go hand in hand, and that wise use of resources was a sign of national strength, not weakness. Opposition remained fierce. Industrialists accused Roosevelt of undermining economic growth, and Congress often resisted his efforts. Lawmakers blocked funding for new forests and tried to limit his authority. But Roosevelt found ways around these obstacles. He used executive orders and the Antiquities Act to protect land when Congress stalled. He rallied public opinion through speeches, magazine articles, and personal visits to threatened sites. Each time he faced resistance, he responded with determination, arguing that the nation's well-being depended on looking beyond short-term profits. Roosevelt's conservation work also changed how Americans saw themselves. He encouraged people to take pride in the country's natural wonders and to see stewardship as a shared duty. National parks and forests became symbols of American identity, places that belong to everyone, not just the wealthy or powerful. Roosevelt's speeches and public appearances made the idea of conservation mainstream, linking it to patriotism and progress. His efforts inspired a new generation of conservationists and set a precedent for future leaders. The agencies and laws he created became the backbone of America's environmental policy. Later presidents would build on his work, expanding protections and creating new parks and refuges. The ethic of stewardship that Roosevelt championed remains a guiding principle for environmental efforts today. Roosevelt's legacy as the father of conservation is visible across the country. National parks, forests, and wildlife refuges continue to offer places for adventure, reflection, and discovery. The land he protected still provides clean water, habitats for wildlife, and opportunities for families to connect with nature. His actions ensured that America's natural heritage would endure, not just for his own time, but for all who came after. The scale and speed of Roosevelt's achievements were unmatched, but what truly set him apart was his sense of responsibility. He saw himself as a caretaker, not just of land, but of the nation's future. He often spoke of the moral obligation to leave the world better than he found it. This belief shaped every decision he made about conservation, and it shaped the country's relationship with its wild places. Even as Roosevelt fought for the land, he faced challenges that tested his resolve in new ways. The same spirit that drove him to confront powerful interests and defend the wilderness would soon be put to the ultimate test, not in a forest or on a mountain, but in a moment of sudden violence that would reveal just how unbreakable his determination could be. The 1912 presidential campaign pushed Theodore Roosevelt back into the national spotlight, but it also set the stage for a moment that would test his endurance in a way few could have imagined. After 2 terms as president, Roosevelt had grown frustrated watching his successor, William Howard Taft, unravel many of his progressive policies. Instead of stepping aside, he took the unusual step of running for president again, this time as the head of the newly formed Progressive Party, which quickly became known as the Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt's decision to challenge both the Republican and Democratic candidates ignited fierce debates and split his former party in two. The stakes were high, the rhetoric was sharp, and the campaign trail was charged with both excitement and tension. By mid-October, the contest between Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson had become one of the most heated in memory. Roosevelt's third-party run drew huge crowds and passionate supporters, but it also attracted critics who accused him of undermining the political system. His speeches championed reforms, labor rights, business regulation, social justice, and his presence on the road was relentless. The energy around him was palpable, but so was the sense of risk. The country was deeply divided, and emotions ran high at every campaign stop. On October 14, 1912, Roosevelt arrived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for a scheduled speech at the city's auditorium. Before the event, he paused at the Gilpatrick Hotel to greet supporters gathered outside. The atmosphere was festive, with people pressing close to catch a glimpse of the former president. As Roosevelt stepped out, waving to the crowd, a man emerged from the throng. John Schrank, an unemployed saloon keeper, raised a revolver and fired a single shot at Roosevelt's chest from just a few feet away. In an instant, chaos broke out. Security and bystanders tackled Schrank, preventing him from firing again. Roosevelt staggered but remained upright, his hand instinctively moving to his chest. For a moment, the crowd froze, unsure if he would collapse. Instead, Roosevelt took a breath, checked his mouth for blood, a trick he'd learned to see if his lung had been pierced, and found none. He realized the bullet had struck something in his jacket before lodging in his chest. Only later would it become clear that a thick, folded copy of his speech and a sturdy metal eyeglasses case had slowed the bullet's path, likely saving his life. Roosevelt's aides and doctors rushed to his side, urging him to go straight to the hospital. But Roosevelt, ever stubborn and determined, insisted on proceeding to the auditorium. He told the men around him, "I will deliver this speech or die." Ignoring pain and the blood staining his shirt, he walked into the packed hall, determined not to let violence silence him. As he stepped onto the stage, the audience greeted him with applause, unaware of what had just happened outside. Roosevelt raised his hand for quiet. In a steady voice, he told them, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." The room fell silent as he opened his coat, revealing the blood-soaked shirt beneath. He explained that the bullet was still lodged in his chest, but reassured the crowd that he was not in immediate danger. Roosevelt then began his speech, reading from the manuscript that had helped save his life. Despite the wound, he spoke for nearly 90 minutes, pausing only occasionally to catch his breath. His words, already powerful, carried even more weight in light of what had just occurred. He spoke about courage, public duty, and the need to stand up for what was right, regardless of personal risk. The audience listened in awe, aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Throughout the speech, Roosevelt's resilience was on full display. He held up the bullet-pierced manuscript, showing the whole as proof of what had happened. The crowd responded with a mix of concern and admiration, torn between urging him to stop and marveling at his resolve. Roosevelt pressed on, refusing to let the attack derail his message or his campaign. After finishing, Roosevelt finally agreed to go to the hospital. Doctors examined him and found that the bullet had fractured a rib and embedded itself in the muscle of his chest. Because the bullet had not pierced his lung or caused severe internal bleeding, the medical team decided it was safer to leave it in place rather than attempt surgery. The bullet would remain in Roosevelt's body for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of the night in Milwaukee. News of the assassination attempt spread quickly. Newspapers across the country carried headlines about Roosevelt's ordeal, describing how he had been shot and yet continued to speak. The story captivated the public, reinforcing the image of Roosevelt as a man who could not be stopped by violence or fear. His declaration, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose," became a rallying cry for his supporters and a symbol of his enduring spirit. The motives behind the attack soon became clear. John Schrank, the would-be assassin, claimed he was motivated by a belief that Roosevelt's bid for a third presidential term violated the tradition set by George Washington. Schrank insisted he bore no personal hatred for Roosevelt, but felt compelled to act for the good of the country. After his arrest, he was declared insane and committed to a psychiatric institution, where he would spend the rest of his life. Despite the shock of the shooting, Roosevelt refused to let the incident define the remainder of his campaign. He continued to travel and speak, though his doctors urged him to rest. The wound slowed him physically, but his determination never wavered. In the end, Roosevelt lost the election to Woodrow Wilson, but his performance as a third-party candidate was unprecedented. He won more votes than any previous independent candidate and pushed progressive ideas into the national conversation. The events in Milwaukee became a defining moment in Roosevelt's life. They showed the country and the world that he was willing to face danger head-on, and that his commitment to public service was unshakable. The bullet in his chest was not just a physical scar, it was a testament to his willingness to endure pain and risk for the causes he believed in. Roosevelt's response to the attack, his calm under pressure, his refusal to abandon his mission, and his ability to inspire others, cemented his reputation as a leader of rare resilience. Public reaction to the shooting was intense. Letters of support poured in from across the country. Many Americans, regardless of political allegiance, expressed admiration for Roosevelt's courage. The image of him standing on stage, bloodied but unbowed, became part of his legend. It reinforced the idea that Roosevelt was more than just a politician, he was a symbol of grit and determination. Roosevelt himself reflected on the incident with characteristic understatement. He acknowledged the risks of public life, but insisted that leaders had a duty to face danger rather than shrink from it. The bullet, he said, was simply part of the job. He wore the scar as a badge of honor, a physical reminder of the values he carried throughout his career. The Milwaukee shooting did not change Roosevelt's outlook on life, but it did deepen the public's understanding of his character. He had always preached the value of living boldly and embracing hardship. Now he had lived those words in the most dramatic way possible. The episode became a touchstone for his philosophy that it was better to face adversity with courage than to retreat in fear. Even after the campaign ended, Roosevelt's reputation as a man who could not be deterred by violence or setbacks only grew. The bull moose label stuck, and his story inspired generations of Americans to see challenges as opportunities to prove one's mettle. The bullet that lodged in his chest became a symbol of his unbreakable will, reminding everyone that true leadership means standing firm, even when the cost is high. As Roosevelt recovered from the attempt on his life, he showed no sign of settling into quiet retirement. The same restless drive that had carried him through battles, political fights, and near-fatal moments continued to shape his choices. For Roosevelt, each new challenge was an invitation to test his limits once again. After his time in the White House, Theodore Roosevelt chose a path few former presidents would dare to follow. In 1913, he accepted an invitation from the Brazilian government to join Colonel Cândido Rondon, one of South America's most respected explorers, on a journey into the heart of the Amazon rainforest. Their mission was to explore and map the River of Doubt, a dark ribbon of water that twisted through uncharted territory. Roosevelt brought along his son Kermit, determined to share one more adventure, and a team that included scientists, local guides, and Brazilian army officers. The Amazon, with its dense jungle, unpredictable rivers, and hidden dangers, promised a challenge unlike anything Roosevelt had faced before. The expedition began with high hopes and careful preparation. The group set out with 7 dugout canoes, food supplies, medical kits, and surveying equipment. Even so, the sheer size and hostility of the rainforest quickly made their plans seem fragile. The heat was stifling and constant, pressing down on the men as they hacked their way through tangled undergrowth. Insects swarmed every exposed inch of skin. Mosquitoes carried malaria, while biting flies left welts that never seemed to heal. The nights offered no relief, just more humidity and the endless drone of the jungle. The river itself was a relentless adversary. The team soon discovered that the River of Doubt was a series of obstacles laid end to end. Powerful rapids lurked around every bend, smashing canoes against hidden rocks and threatening to sweep men and supplies downstream. Within the first 2 weeks, 5 of the 7 canoes were lost in accidents, leaving the expedition short of transport and forced to carry what remained through thick jungle along the river's edge. Portaging meant hours of dragging heavy boats and supplies overland, hacking a path with machetes, and fending off biting ants and other hazards underfoot. Food became a daily concern. The original rations, beans, rice, dried meat, dwindled quickly. The dense jungle made hunting difficult, and fishing offered little comfort in waters teeming with piranhas. Sometimes a single fish was all they had to share between several men. Hunger gnawed at the group, sapping their strength and making every task harder. Even drinking water was risky. The river was full of parasites and bacteria, and the threat of dysentery was ever present. The men lost weight rapidly, and exhaustion set in. Physical hardship soon gave way to real danger. Roosevelt, already worn down by the journey, suffered a deep gash on his leg while trying to maneuver a canoe through a rapid. The wound quickly became infected in the hot, damp conditions. As the infection spread, Roosevelt developed a high fever and chills. He grew weaker by the day, struggling to keep up with the group. At times, he was delirious, barely able to sit upright in the canoe. It was a bitter blow, just being a passenger. The situation reached a critical point when Roosevelt, recognizing how much he was slowing the group, told Kermit to leave him behind and save the rest of the team. He believed he had become a burden and that his continued presence might doom the expedition. Kermit, however, refused to abandon his father. The bond between them deepened in those desperate days, with Kermit supporting Roosevelt both physically and emotionally as they pressed on together. The rainforest offered little comfort. The threat of hostile encounters with indigenous tribes was real, and the team moved with caution and respect, careful not to provoke or trespass. Colonel Rondon, who had spent years working in the Amazon, insisted on maintaining peaceful relations, and Roosevelt supported this approach. Still, the constant need for vigilance added another layer of stress to an already grueling journey. As the expedition dragged on, the group's numbers thinned. Some men died from drowning or illness. The survivors were pushed to their limits, surviving on scraps and hope. Roosevelt's health continued to deteriorate. He lost more than 60 pounds over the course of the trip, and the infection in his leg never fully healed. At times, he drifted in and out of consciousness, kept alive by sheer willpower and the determination not to give up. Despite these hardships, the team pressed forward, driven by the goal of mapping the river and reaching civilization. The jungle seemed endless, each day blending into the next, marked only by new obstacles and setbacks. Yet Roosevelt's presence was a source of inspiration. Even in his weakened state, he insisted on keeping detailed notes, recording scientific observations, and encouraging the others to keep going. His philosophy of the strenuous life was not just a slogan, it was a way of living, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. When the expedition finally emerged from the jungle, they had accomplished what they set out to do. The River of Doubt, once a blank space on the map, was now charted. The Brazilian government renamed it the Rio Roosevelt in honor of the former president's role. Their achievement was recognized by the scientific community, and the expedition became a story of both exploration and survival. The cost, however, was high. Roosevelt's health never fully recovered. The infection and the physical toll of the journey left him permanently weakened. Friends and family noticed the change in him. He moved more slowly, and the robust energy that had once defined him was diminished. Yet he never regretted the decision to go. The Amazon expedition, for all its dangers, was a final affirmation of his belief that life was meant to be lived fully, regardless of the risks. The journey also shaped how others saw Roosevelt. Newspapers around the world reported on his ordeal, painting him as a symbol of courage and endurance. The story of the former president who braved the unknown, faced death, and refused to surrender captured the public imagination. For many, it was the ultimate proof of Roosevelt's character, a man who did not shrink from hardship, who faced the unknown with resolve, and who inspired those around him to do the same. Looking back, the Amazon expedition stands out as more than just another adventure. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent seeking new challenges and refusing to accept limits. Roosevelt's willingness to risk everything for the sake of discovery and principle left a lasting impression on those who followed. The river he helped map remains a testament to his drive, his resilience, and his belief in pushing the boundaries of what is possible. As Roosevelt returned home, changed by the ordeal but unbroken in spirit, his story continued to grow. The expedition became a fitting chapter in a life marked by transformation, of self, of country, and of what people believed was possible. The lessons learned in the Amazon and throughout Roosevelt's remarkable journey would go on to shape not just his legacy, but the very idea of what it means to face challenges with courage and purpose. Roosevelt's impact on the United States stands out as one of the most significant in presidential history. The story of his legacy is not just about the achievements of a single leader, but about how his choices and values reshaped the nation's direction. His influence can be traced through the way he approached every challenge, not as a fixed obstacle, but as an opportunity to build something better, both for himself and for the country. Throughout his life, Roosevelt embodied the idea that personal growth and national progress often go hand in hand. He began as a child defined by frailty, yet he transformed himself through discipline and sheer will. This pattern of self-improvement became a blueprint for his approach to public life. Each stage of his journey, whether as a rancher, a soldier, a reformer, or a president, reflected the broader changes happening in America at the turn of the century. The country was wrestling with rapid industrialization, urban growth, and the challenges of becoming a global power. Roosevelt's willingness to adapt, to confront new problems head-on, and to lead by example helped guide the nation through a period of uncertainty and transformation. Roosevelt's presidency brought a new sense of energy to the White House. Before his time, the office often operated in the background, with presidents acting as caretakers rather than as leaders who shaped the national agenda. Roosevelt changed that. He believed the president should act boldly when the public good was at stake, and he used every tool available to him. His stewardship theory argued that unless something was expressly forbidden by law, the president had a duty to act for the nation's benefit. This approach set a precedent for future leaders, making the executive branch a center of action and innovation. One of Roosevelt's most lasting contributions was his approach to economic power. At the start of the 20th century, trusts and monopolies controlled much of the country's wealth and influence. These corporations often acted without regard for workers, small businesses, or the broader public. Roosevelt saw the dangers in this imbalance. He used the Sherman Antitrust Act to challenge monopolies like the Northern Securities Company and Standard Oil, sending a clear message that no business was above the law. His administration filed dozens of antitrust suits, and his efforts led to the breakup of some of the largest corporate empires of the era. Roosevelt's actions did more than just disrupt business as usual. They signaled a shift in how Americans thought about fairness and the role of government. By standing up to powerful interests, Roosevelt helped restore public confidence in the idea that the government could serve ordinary people. He believed in the need for regulation, not to stifle innovation, but to ensure that prosperity was shared and that competition remained fair. This philosophy shaped later reforms and continues to influence economic policy today. His vision for the country extended far beyond the economy. Roosevelt was one of the first presidents to recognize the importance of conservation. At a time when many saw natural resources as limitless, he understood the need to protect forests, rivers, and wildlife for future generations. He created the U.S. Forest Service, established 5 new national parks, and set aside millions of acres as national forests and wildlife refuges. The Antiquities Act gave him the power to declare national monuments, which he used to protect landmarks like the Grand Canyon. These actions helped lay the foundation for the modern environmental movement and changed how Americans relate to the land. Roosevelt's conservation efforts were not always popular. Business leaders and some members of Congress argued that his policies threatened economic growth. But Roosevelt insisted that responsible stewardship of natural resources was essential for the nation's long-term health. He believed that the land belonged not just to those living in the present, but to all future Americans. By protecting wild spaces, he hoped to give coming generations the chance to experience the same sense of wonder and renewal that he had found in nature. The changes Roosevelt brought to the presidency also affected the way leaders communicate with the public. He was a master of the bully pulpit, using speeches, interviews, and the press to shape public opinion and rally support for his ideas. Roosevelt spoke directly to citizens, explaining complex issues in clear, relatable terms. This approach helped make the office more accessible and responsive, encouraging a closer relationship between the government and the people it served. Roosevelt's influence reached into the everyday lives of Americans as well. His square deal philosophy promoted fairness in labor relations, consumer protection, and business regulation. He intervened in labor disputes when workers' rights were at risk, as in the 1902 coal strike, and championed laws to ensure the safety of food and medicine. These reforms improved working conditions, protected consumers, and set new standards for corporate responsibility. Beyond policy, Roosevelt's legacy is also about the example he set. He lived by the principle that a meaningful life requires effort, courage, and engagement with the world. His idea of the strenuous life encouraged people to embrace challenges, learn from setbacks, and keep striving for improvement. Roosevelt's own experiences, overcoming illness, facing danger in war and exploration, and taking on powerful interests, made his message authentic and relatable. He showed that leadership is not about avoiding risk, but about meeting it with determination and a sense of duty. Roosevelt's story continues to resonate because it speaks to the possibility of change, both for individuals and for society. His life was filled with setbacks and criticism. He made mistakes and sometimes acted with more energy than caution. Yet his willingness to act, to experiment, and to learn from failure helped move the country forward. He believed that progress was always possible, and that the greatest rewards came from work that benefited others. The institutions and policies Roosevelt helped create still shape American life. National parks and forests offer places for recreation and reflection. Antitrust laws and regulatory agencies continue to guard against abuses of power. The idea that government can be a force for good remains central to debates about public policy. Roosevelt's legacy is visible not just in the physical landmarks he preserved, but in the values he championed: fairness, courage, and the pursuit of a common good. Roosevelt's impact can also be seen in the leaders who followed him. Presidents from Franklin D. Roosevelt to John F. Kennedy and beyond have drawn inspiration from his example. They have adopted his belief in active leadership, his willingness to confront difficult problems, and his commitment to serving the broader public. The office of the president, once seen as a passive role, became a platform for change because of the standard Roosevelt set. His influence extends outside of politics. The idea that anyone can overcome adversity and make a difference has inspired generations of Americans. Roosevelt's life reminds us that transformation is not reserved for the powerful or the privileged. It is possible for anyone who is willing to work, adapt, and persevere. His story challenges us to look at our own lives and ask what changes we might pursue, what obstacles we might overcome, and what legacy we might leave behind. As we look back on Roosevelt's years, it's clear that his legacy is more than a collection of achievements. It is a reminder that leadership, at its best, is about service, vision, and the courage to act. Roosevelt's example continues to shape how Americans think about their country and their own potential to make a difference. The lessons of his life remain relevant, offering guidance for anyone facing uncertainty or seeking to create positive change. Roosevelt's story stands as a testament to the power of transformation in both personal and national life. His years in office and beyond show how one person's choices can influence the course of a country. Understanding his legacy invites us to reflect on how we respond to challenges and what kind of future we want to help build. Roosevelt's journey reminds us that growth and change can reach far beyond the individual. His rise from a frail child to a leader who shaped American identity shows how determination and action can influence the world around us. Through his work in conservation, his push for fairness in government and business, and his belief in active citizenship, Roosevelt created a legacy that still shapes the way we think about leadership and responsibility. As you consider his story, think about the obstacles that have challenged you and the values that guide your choices. Roosevelt's example encourages us to meet difficulty with effort, to act with purpose, and to leave our own mark, however large or small, on the world we share. Thank you for listening to tonight's journey through history. We hope it brought you peace, rest, and a little wonder. Let us know in the comments, where are you listening from? What time is it? And did this story help you unwind tonight? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Exhausting Stories so you never miss another trip through time. Good night.